There is a fine line, a razor's edge between good governance and regulating innovation out of existence. This week, we're going to find out which side of the line the US government cares to be on. Ready? Let's go. We've been discussing these regulatory developments a lot lately, but that's only because they truly are the most important things going on in crypto right now. And if a lot of this type of legislation is passed across the industrialized countries, it could be highly prejudicial to our Cardano experience even years from now. You already know that the infrastructure bill currently in Congress is centerpiece legislation for the current administration. And it has some overly broad, last minute, tacked on language about crypto tax reporting that's meant to help pay for this giant $1 trillion bill. The language in that bill originally looked like this. It basically says that any person who is getting paid to facilitate transfers of digital assets needs to report those transactions, including the names, addresses, data like that, about the parties involved to the IRS. The problem is this original language used words like even, phrases like even if non-custodial. And it was super obvious to everyone immediately. This was very problematic for the crypto space because this would include all manner of block validators, transaction validators like miners and stake pool operators who could never even hope to have access to the kind of data that would be required to be reported. Jerry Brito of Coin Center, who we talked about multiple times in the last week or so, had this to say. He says, "We didn't get the language we wanted in the final bill text. It's better, but still not good enough to exclude minors and similarly situated persons. That would be stake pool operators." Here's the language he's reporting they have in the bill right now. Any person who, for consideration, is responsible for regularly providing any service effectuating transfers of digital assets on behalf of another person. This is a little bit better. They got rid of the non-custodial language and some of the other language, which was more expansive than this. The problem we've got here is that it's still very broad. They got rid of some of the really prejudicial language, but it's prejudicial from a crypto perspective, but it's still really broad. Any person who's getting paid, who regularly effectuates transfers of digital assets on behalf of another person. This is pretty broad. This would still, someone could still argue that this includes miners and stake pool operators and a whole host of other actors in crypto. This is Congress we're talking about here. So when he says final bill text, final is not really final. He follows up that original post by saying, starting tomorrow, there will be an amendment process where changes to the bill can still be made. We're working with our friends and allies in the Senate to make that happen. Caitlin Long is reporting here that certain senators involved in the bill are trying to create a legislative record to indicate that node operators, miners, validators like stake pool operators shouldn't be covered by this language, but that they refuse to include that in the actual bill. They could easily just include language excluding those types of crypto actors from the coverage, but they refuse to do so because they don't think the bill would pass if they did that. So they're basically putting all the power in the hands of, regulatory agency staff to interpret what that language means. What she's pointing out here is that unelected bureaucrats would get to decide if Cardano stake pool operators fit this definition. And it gets pretty sketchy at that point because the definition has only a few elements. Are they doing this for consideration? Are they getting paid for it? Well, yeah, they're getting paid for it. Are they responsible for regularly providing a service that is effectuating transfers of ADA? Yeah, you could argue they're effectuating transfers of ADA. Are they doing it on behalf of another person? Maybe you argue they're doing it on behalf of the system. They're not doing it on behalf of the people making the transfers. But I think you can see how the wrong bureaucrat could easily come to a conclusion that someone like a Cardano stake pool operator is effectuating transfers of ADA on behalf of people using ADA for consideration because they stake pool operators do make money doing this. So it's a pretty bad precedent to set that bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats, get to decide whether or not miners and node operators and stake pool operators and those types of block validators fit into a definition like this. Because if those bureaucrats decide that, say, Cardano stake pool operators do in fact fit in this definition, we already know it's impossible for those stake pool operators. There's nothing currently in the system that would allow them to KYC their customers. And the data that would be required to be reported would require them to KYC they're not even customers, but the people making those transactions. I mean, we're not talking about the delegators. We're not talking about just the delegators of stake pool here. We're talking about the people who are actually involved in the transactions that are being validated in the blocks that the stake pool operators are validating. There's nothing in the system that would allow this to happen. And the same thing is true of Ethereum and Bitcoin and all the other blockchains we can really think of off the cuff that, regardless of whether they're proof of work or proof of stake. We don't really know what those unelected bureaucrats would do with this kind of language. We don't know if they would say that Cardano stake pools were covered in this language or not. But in this scenario where they did say that SPOs were covered, I mean, those stake pool operators, if they're under US jurisdiction, I mean, it seems like they only have a couple of different options. They could fold up shop in the US and go somewhere else. They could try to evade enforcement. Not a good idea. They could try to stay in the US and evade enforcement. Typically not a good idea. They could try to wait for some kind of legal challenge in the courts to this language in this statute. Unfortunately, and I think there probably would be some kind of test case of this, but unfortunately that would take a long time. It would be highly disruptive to the operation of stake pools inside US jurisdiction if they had to wait for a legal challenge. So in this scenario, you would probably see a flight of stake pools from US jurisdictions to offshore locations. And, for a lot of stake pools, that's not feasible. They would just have to shut down and cease all operations. So even though it's coming to us sort of donning the mantle of crushing tax evasion in crypto, the practical effect of this would be very similar to China's recent ban of miners. And it seems like a lot of us in the crypto space were, kind of happy that some portion of that concentration of Chinese miners in proof of work blockchains was going to migrate to places like North America and probably Europe and other places outside of China. But even though this is probably for very different philosophical reasons, the effect of this kind of scenario would be the same as that Chinese ban on Bitcoin mining. This would have secondary knock-on effects. It wouldn't just be stake pools. If this scenario became true, anybody starting any kind of innovative blockchain-related company who is thinking about housing it in the US would probably have second thoughts, because if the US was willing to impose such onerous tax reporting requirements on stake pools that the stake pools could no longer exist in the US, pretty much anything in the blockchain industry could be regulated out of existence at any time by US regulators. So nobody would really want to start a blockchain business in the US, or at least it wouldn't be considered the most friendly jurisdiction if even mining and running a node and running a stake pool had already been regulated out of existence within US borders. It would be an overall chilling effect on innovation in the crypto space overall within the US. And the problem is the US is such a big economic actor on a global scale. Typically, if the US enacts regulations like this, they're not the only country to do so. If we saw regulations like this across a any kind of a significant swath of developed industrialized countries, this could be really bad overall for crypto. This could have a chilling effect on innovation in crypto overall, globally. We don't know what's going to happen here. There could be some kind of modification to this language during the amendment process this week. It could be that a regulatory staff would get their hands on this and they would choose to interpret this such that they wouldn't enforce against miners and nodes and stake pools. It could be that there could be some kind of swift and immediate judicial rejection of this language on whatever grounds. Swift and judicial these days don't seem to go hand in hand, but any number of things could happen. We don't know at this point. I think all we can do is keep our fingers crossed that cooler heads prevail. It'll be interesting to see what actually goes down. Talk to you tomorrow.